it occurs to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that many could see, especially at the beginning of the book of Acts, whenever there was a conflict or an issue of controversy in the early days of the church, it always resulted in growth. From chapter 2 of 3,000, then there's probably to 5,000. And then in chapter 8, when they tried to stamp out Christianity, that the result of that was it spread everywhere. And so every time that there was a major problem or a conflict or controversy, there was always someone who would sit back and look at that and say, no, that's not right. The Jews were exposing themselves as the fanatical hypocrites that they were. And so right-thinking people that use good sense and logic would see that and say, no, what Paul is doing, he's making sense. That's why a couple of times we've read when Paul would go into the synagogue and he would reason with them. He didn't preach. He didn't pound it down their throats. He reasoned with them, and they thought about it, and putting the things together, they saw the more full picture of the gospel and of God's plan. The thing that was missing is, I think we mentioned this maybe Wednesday night, I'm not sure when it was, last few weeks are blur, but somewhere in there we were mentioning about the fact that one of the basic problems of Judaism is that it was incomplete. It never brought satisfaction. They were always looking towards the Messiah, towards a promise. There wasn't that sense of now I'm saved. In Judaism, they were waiting every year to offer sacrifice for their atonement, and then they'd have to do it again the next year, and the next year, and they were constantly making sacrifice and being told that the blood of bulls and goats, that's not going to do it. It may for a short while, but we're waiting for the Messiah. When Christianity came, now it's the full picture. And I'm confident that none of us here in this culture or world today can appreciate or understand, even comprehend how wonderful a feeling it was to the Gentiles. Like Cornelius in Acts 10, who was a devout man. He prayed to God, gave alms, but he wasn't saved, and he knew it. What a wonderful feeling that would come to him when Peter showed him the whole gospel and said, now, because of Jesus, your sins are washed away, and you can stand complete, whole, and righteous before God as his son. For those Gentiles who for generations have been taught that you're second-class citizens and you'll never be the people of God. We are. You're not. And that kind of radical dysfunction, once they heard the gospel, this was an immense relief and a cause for joy. And so I say all of that because I'm confident all of these factors are involved in it. After this little incident in front of the Bema, the judgment seat, Paul's not going to turn around and leave. There's more work to be done because there will almost certainly be people still left in Corinth that are wanting to hear this. And you remember what God said a few verses earlier to Paul, why he had to stay there longer? He said, for I have many people in this city. So Corinth was, he hit the mother lode there. There was a great vein, putting in those terms, of Christians or of people who were going to be devoted to God and who were ready for the gospel. So Paul is not going to be in a hurry to leave Corinth. This is one of the faults that every preacher has. Well, not every, but many preachers have had for several generations, is that when they go into a region and they teach and they're able to do a good work, establish a church, they're ready to move on to another one and another one. And that sometimes causes problems, particularly in this country. I'll just give you a really quick restoration history lesson. In the early 1800s and up to about the mid-1800s, when these preachers who rode on mules or walked from place to place all through the Northeast down into the Ohio Valley and even further south, they would go into areas, and they would preach the gospel and would convert entire congregations. And after a week, 2 or 3 week meeting, they would tear the sign down of whatever denomination it was and just put up the Lord's Church, the Church of Christ, something of that nature, and baptize the whole congregation, and then move on. Wow, we got this great. Let's go to the next one. What happened was that in their wake, these churches that had just heard the gospel, and now the man is left, they were left to their own, they began to falter and have some, they were babes. They needed teaching. They needed more teaching. And so there was a sense in which many of those churches were lost. In just a few short years, they went right back into denominationalism of some kind. Likewise with pagan. When paganism is all around them, they hear the gospel, they're ready for it, they obey it, they're excited, they see the salvation that's there, and then the one who has brought them the message has left, and now they don't have a New Testament. They don't have what you and I are holding in our hand right now. What do they have? They may get a piece of a letter that's been circulated. That's why during that period of time, in the middle of the first century, until John, all of these folks and these congregations, they were vulnerable to all manner of false teaching because they did not have book, chapter, and verse to point to. He said, this is what God said. That's why in the beginning of the Corinthian letter, Paul said, there are many who say, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas. They were following the teachings of certain men. And following those men, they began to factionalize. That happened right here in this city. They factionalized following their different favorite teacher, whoever that was. And that's why it became imperative that as soon as that which was perfect is come, that is what they have, the full revelation, now it is written down, and as we'll see in this morning's sermon today, as we studied a few weeks ago in Ephesians 3, that whole process that the Holy Spirit reveals to the apostles, they write it down, we read it, we understand it, we obey it. But they had to write it down. And so we want to, we don't want to be too quick to judge these people out there, just a bunch of weak, faithless people. They didn't have the New Testament. They had copies of the scrolls of the Torah, but that wasn't going to help them in this age. So I think all of that is a part of that statement in verse 18, when Paul still remained a good while. So he's going to get everything settled down, and et cetera. Yes?
But they did have gifts. The apostles gave them gifts.
Yes.
So they had that to guide them.
Yes.
Where we have the scriptures.
Mark 16:20, that's right.
We no longer have gifts.
But that would be short-lived.
But
Very
they
short.
still had something to go by because of different gifts of prayer and so forth, and
Yeah.
preaching and so forth.
And they still had problems with that. When we read the first letter of Corinthians, they still had issues with that. They needed to have it written down from God. So that was all. This was that period of time that it was there was some jeopardy there. There was some. It was a dangerous time, I should put it this way. Is that until they had the scriptures fulfilled, written down where they could read it, they were susceptible to all of these manners of things. So Paul remains there, and verse 18, he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. Now, this is just another, let's come back here. You remember when we talked about this area right there? That in Cenchrea, that's where Priscilla and Aquila were with Paul, and they were making tents over in this region right here. They're going to go with him, because where he's going to go now in our little map that we have here is that they're going to leave Corinth, and he's going to sail over to Ephesus and meet with the brethren that he had been there before on the first trip. Then he's going to set sail to Jerusalem, and he's going to go there pretty quickly. He's not going to waste any time because he has shaved his head, we're going to read. He's taken a vow. What that vow was, we don't know, but he needed to fulfill that vow. It is generally understood, and I think in all likelihood so, the vow was taken. It wasn't a pagan vow, obviously, and it would not be a vow of in the new law of the gospel. It would be a vow for the Jews, and that as Paul would teach the others, that they had to, when in Rome, he lived as a Roman, and now living among the Jews, he's going to take this vow, and he is going to keep this vow in front of the Jews, so that they do not see him as a total enemy of the Mosaic law. As Jesus would say, I didn't come to destroy it, I came to fulfill it. Paul is going to have the same attitude. I'm not here to destroy the law. Where actually the gospel is going to fulfill the law, but in a matter of deference to the Jewish people. For whatever reason, he has taken this vow, and he needs to go to Jerusalem to complete it. And the thought here is that had he completed this vow over here in Europe, it wouldn't make any real difference to the Jews in Jerusalem. He needs to go back to Jerusalem in front of all of the people who are there and let them see him complete this vow so they are at ease. No telling what has been said about Paul while he's been gone, about how evil and vicious and how malignant his teaching is to the old law, that he hates Moses. You can just imagine how they would put all that together. So, in the end of that verse here, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them, that's Aquila and Priscilla. He left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent. He's got to move on, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. Well, he's going to come back here on his third trip and spend some time. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the brethren, he went down to Antioch. Now let's go over this again so that we understand. In their time, in the first century, when you went up or down, it meant elevation. It did not mean direction. We go up north, down south, back east, out front, out west. They went up or down according to elevation. When he came to Jerusalem, right down here, this is in the hill country. And so he went down to Antioch. Antioch's down here by the coast. So that's all that means, though he didn't head north. Antioch is where the journeys began and ended. So one thing you might want to mark in your Bible here in verse 23 is that verse 22 is the end of the second journey. Verse 23 is the beginning of the third journey. So here's the end. The second journey finishes in verse 22. The third journey starts in the next verse, verse 23. Now, before we get into the third journey, we'll start that Wednesday night, Lord willing. We want to come back here for a little bit and look at things. We're going to talk about Caesarea in a few weeks when Paul is in prison there. And there's a lot to know about Caesarea. But before we get there, I want to look at something here for us. Turn to Romans chapter 16. The last chapter of Romans is one of the best lists of salutations in all of the New Testament. If you start reading the last chapter of Romans, this is at the end of this letter, Paul is saying, say hello to him, say hello to them. This guy says hi, that guy says, it's all these, so-and-so says hello. That's basically the gist of that. Now, what I want to draw our attention to is in verse 23 of Romans 16. Paul writes, Gaius, my host, and the host of the whole church, greet you. Erastus, the treasurer of the city, greets you. And Quartus, a brother. Now, he wrote Romans from Corinth. When he comes back to Corinth, he's going to write this letter. So he's writing this from Corinth. And he mentions one of the brothers there. There are several there that they know. But in particular, Erastus, the treasurer of the city. Now, this was discovered here in this last century. That when you get right there, when you get, let me do it this way. Excuse me, it's better to get it up. Yeah, right there. Okay, I'm going to go real slow because I know when pictures flash in front of you, it's hard to get a bearing here. The bearing on the city of Corinth here is that here was the main city, and the road that would have gone up to, that we saw a moment earlier, it would go up to the main city. The judgment seat would have been right about there, and over here was the temple of Apollo, and that's those little columns. I'll come back and show you again. It's the reason why I took a picture of it. It's the oldest Greek temple in existence. It was, it's considered to be over 4,600 years old, that the Greeks built this temple to Apollo. But right over there where the temple is, you see the terrace that drops down? Right over there against that terrace is the remnants of a theater, of an amphitheater. And the amphitheater is usually built up against a mountain. The best way to do that, you see how that's built up there. And then in the surrounding area, they would have a courtyard. They would have kind of a plaza. Yeah, that's the better word for it. Yeah. Well, here's something that is noteworthy of Corinthian law, is that the city officials that were appointed at Corinth and other places like it were never paid a dime. One of the prerequisites that they had to be independently wealthy. And not only did they have to be independently wealthy, they had to, out of their own pocket, pay for the public works. A magistrate was a city official that was in charge of the buildings and the streets. Charge of the money. Now, we just read in Romans 16:23 that Erastus, the city treasurer. Well, what city? It's the city right here. And as you go down to that theater and down in front of it, this is part of the plaza. The plaza would be probably about the size of this building, something like that. And it's paved. And you know, you've gone to places where people have made contributions to a cause, and so they put their name on a brick or a stone and lay it there as a paver. And you can read all the different names of the contributors to what it is. And it's in this courtyard or whatever it is. That's what this is. And what this stone is saying is this. Erastus, there's his name right there. And as it continues over there, the translation is, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, and aedile was a city magistrate, he laid this payment at his own expense. Now, we can't go back and prove 100%, but all of the indications point to the fact that this is the man that Paul mentions in Romans 16:23. He's the city treasurer, and here is the pavement that he has laid at his own expense for the city as he served as the city treasurer. Now, several things come to mind about this. Is that the first thing, here is a person of prominence, a person of position and importance, a person certainly that would have extraordinary influence in the city, and he's a brother in Christ. Whatever is going on back in Jerusalem, where Christians were hiding from Jews because of the persecution, it certainly appears from the story that we've just read here in the 18th chapter and Gallio being the proconsul, and his disregard, maybe even disdain for the Jewish law, and the arguing that they're going to say, you guys see to it, I don't want to be bothered with it. That coupled with now these people that are part of the church at Corinth, they didn't suffer from persecution. There's no indication. But isn't it interesting, as we noted a couple of weeks ago in the class, thank goodness for Corinth and all the trouble they had. Because Paul would record for us, for all time, in 2 letters, cataloging all of their problems, all of their sins, their shortcomings, their hypocrisy, and how they were dealing with it. And then in the second letter, how they were able to reconcile with the brother who had sinned, and how they were able to reconcile with each other. In the first letter, they were suing each other. They were taking each other to law. Now, this is important to stop and think about this for a moment, that the character of not just the city, but of the church in Corinth was unlike what we might see back in Judea, where the Christians huddled for defense and sometimes would hide. Later in Rome, do the same things in the catacombs because they were being persecuted. There's no persecution in Corinth. Now, there are problems from the Jews, but the city leaders got that out of the way. There's no more trouble. That's why Paul stays there a little longer. It's like another door has been opened up. And God told Paul, you stay here, because I have many people in this city. No one's going to hurt you. So this is another reason why the Corinthian church was so extraordinary, so unique in its flaws and in its strengths. That's why more is written about that church than any other church or person in the epistles. The Corinthian letters are the longest letters in the New Testament. So thank goodness for Corinth and all of its dysfunction, because it has shown and taught us a whole lot. Yes? Eric?
It makes you think that when Paul told them they were, taking each other to court and you're suing each other, and he said, don't you have men among you that have some wisdom and some understanding, like maybe the city clerk, or
Right.
the treasurer who knows the city laws and is well versed in finance and might have some common sense?
Yeah, you would sure hope so. Yeah, I would think so. And Rastus, yeah, we'll take care of that. Because there's no mention of that here in the second letter. Evidently, they took care of it. Paul shamed them well enough that they said, okay, we'll drop everything. I went to a church one time, and I talked to the elders and said, now, is there any problem here? No, there's no problem here at all. No, are you sure? No, everything, no problem. Okay. All right. After 2 weeks, I found out that 2 of the brethren were suing each other, and they're taking each other to court. Time out here. I would say that's a problem. Oh, no, it's no big deal. Oh, really? Okay. It's just funny how people are, and I would hope to think that they were able to get over that here in Corinth, but this was not, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that Christianity was only reserved for the poor and ignorant. It wasn't. The gospel message appealed to everyone. It made sense. Joey?
There's a really interesting book called The Rise of Christianity. And the man who wrote it is named Rodney Stark, and he is just a sociologist and a professor. He's not writing from the standpoint of a believer, but it's a history. He talks about the great rise in cities of Christianity and how really big and important it became because the apostles and people would go in and draw huge crowds. And it's just like you said, it wasn't just the poor, etc. And he also talks about the impact that women had in the early church. And he's got a new book out right now, but really interesting from the secular standpoint of just history. But at the end, he said, the interesting thing is, this really just all came about by one was validating to read.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something else I read a long time ago about Corinth, is that when we had described the promiscuity in the city of Corinth that had preceded when Paul came, and how the immorality had been rampant and everybody had served up at that temple one time in their life, and so that some would conclude that everybody had had everybody at one time or another within a generation, and who knew whose kids were whose. And it was that kind of immorality that from that, when Christianity was introduced, the most dramatic change was really in the women. And the women became so demonstrably humble, faithful, and godly that one of their historians, and his name is going to slip me here, it always does, but had made the remark in his writings, he said, and describing how these women would dress and how they would behave, and he had made this remark, said, "Oh, what women these Christians have." That the women of Corinth, of the city, they were just like alley cats. But when Christianity came, it transformed the people, and that transformation was not seen any more greater than in the women themselves. That was the greatest manifestation. So that's just it's a wonderful thing, and we know that even today, no creature of God can sink as low as a woman. Conversely, no creature of God can rise to the heights of a woman. She was the crowning touch on his creation. Nothing is more virtuous than a virtuous woman, but nothing is more repulsive and repugnant than an unvirtuous woman. Barry?
The concept of the church being only for the poor is something that, we've thought about for years, and he says, bring the poor, bring the downtrodden, and it's supposed to be an inclusive tent, if you want to put it that way. But in every one of these cases, the ruler of the synagogue, or the guy that runs the synagogue, who's very powerful in the city, and here, this ruler, Matthew, was a tax collector for the Roman government. Luke's a doctor. I mean, these were not all the poor and downtrodden. Paul was as highly educated as any of them.
Right.
I mean, he became poor for the gospel, but he was not poor to start with.
Right.
He was well respected. He was well educated, most likely on the Sanhedrin Council. I mean, this was not a low rent guy. And
right.
So sometimes we get the perception that we can only go to those who are poor or who are lowly, and certainly we should not exclude those we should include, but it's also for those who can get a little haughty.
That's exactly right. Think of the fact, the very first Gentile converted, Cornelius, was a centurion in the Roman army, had his own household, had position, he had wealth, he had power and influence, and he was ready. And it was Peter, the one who was reluctant. This poor fisherman was reluctant to preach the gospel to this powerful Roman. And God had to kind of just box his ears and say, Peter, came to him in that vision, all these unclean, what I've called clean, don't you call unclean. Get up and get over there. Go down to Joppa. I got a job for you. So I'm sure along the way Peter's thinking, man, who am I to do this? And I can't go in his house. I'd be unclean. And our Lord is basically knocking Peter down and saying, hey, get with the program here. It's not what you thought. It's for everybody. The gospel is for all. And first Gentile is a wealthy, prominent person that receives the gospel. And after that, who knows how many more. From Athens, the Sermon on Mars Hill, one of Dionysius, one of the Areopagites, and would say leading women who were of importance, who were of prominence and influence within the city. So this is just another, I just wanted to add that while we're in Corinth to look at the city, that's what we find there, and it's just, to me, it's an extraordinary thing to consider. All right, any question or comment as we come to the end of the second journey here when he's rapidly trying to get down to Jerusalem to finish this vow. He finishes it, and then he goes up to the church at Antioch. And verse 23, where we pick up now, after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. What he will do is this. That map, we're on another program here. What he's going to do is that after he has completed the vow in Jerusalem and made his way down to Antioch, that's his home church. So he's going to spend time there. He gives a report and tells them everything that's happening. Don't you know these people they're thrilled and they're beyond curious. They don't travel like Paul has gone over now into Europe and he's preaching the gospel. They want to hear about this. So he tells them all about this, and so I'm sure they're saying, this is great, do it again. Let's do it again. So they probably, got some funds together and some people prepared, and what he does is that he is going to go back, in this here's Phrygia and Galatia up here. He's going to go back and revisit all of these churches that he had gone to on his first journey and see how they're doing. So there's some wisdom there that he will go back and check up on them. And it's a good thing he did, because if you remember how the book of Galatians begins, in Galatians, he finds out that they have left the gospel. And some teachers have come in, and he makes the point that you've taught another gospel, which wasn't the gospel that I gave you. And he gives that very stern warning. Matter of fact, let's just take a few moments and turn there to Galatians chapter 1. This is what's going to happen here now on this third journey. When he goes there and finds out, after he had already established it earlier, here's what he discovers. Verse 6 of Galatians 1. I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, in some translations, it'll show the distinction a little bit better. There are two different words. You can have different and another. Another meaning, okay, I've got a grapefruit and I have an orange. One is a citrus fruit, but the orange is another. But they're the same kind. They're the same kind. But then he says, but you're preaching a different God. That means one of another kind, not the same kind. Here's the citrus fruit that have come to you, and now you're preaching eggplant. You're preaching okra. Ugh.
That's great.
And so that's what he's saying is they're not preaching the same gospel that Paul had given them, that had been reduced, but they're preaching a different one. And then he follows that with a scathing warning about that. And so that's why he is going to go back and revisit all these people in these places, just as we had noted a little earlier in the class today, that you can't expect people just to hear the gospel and then from that point on, they'll always mature on their own. We need help. Everybody needs help. None of us have gotten to the point of our faith alone. Every one of us have needed and taken advantage of the help that others have given us to teach us along. No one person is the product of their sole study. We're a product of many people's study. You pick up a commentary, that's a product of somebody else's study. That's helping you there. All right, any other question or comment about the end of the second journey here? This is a good place to stop Wednesday morning. Yeah, will y'all be here Wednesday morning? Yeah. Wednesday night we'll have a new map up here, and we'll start the third journey and see all the dynamics around it. But we'll close for there and pick up Wednesday night. Thank you for your good attention.
Exactly.